Managing for kiosk mode. Kiosks are a pain in the neck, aren't they? Well, at least they used to be. Well, if you have a really locked down kiosk and you're using desktop virtualization, well, that kiosk can be, well, it can be just kind of a source for launching your view client, right? If I've got a really locked down, very tailored environment, if I've done everything correctly from a security perspective, and I've got some sort of authentication that's in there, well, I could even have it set up in such a way that a user wouldn't necessarily need to authenticate to the kiosk. They could just at the kiosk launch right into their virtual desktop, and then they're off to the races. And in fact, that's actually what VMware is kind of attempting to do here with its whole kiosk mode for VMware View. Kiosk mode uses thin clients or heavily locked down PCs running the View client to connect to virtual desktops. Now, you can have end users log into the client device. It is perfectly acceptable, but generally in these situations, the idea is that the end user does not typically log on to the client device. And that means you can't, even if the user is not logging in, you still have to have some way of authenticating, well, that device to your View infrastructure. And so View Manager actually uses this thing called flexible authentication. It's kind of a VMware thing to authenticate the client's device rather than the end user's user authentication. Okay, so there's still authentication there, but it's a device level instead of a user level. And that authentication can be done by registering the device's MAC address. So the MAC address never changes, right? Unless you change the network card. Or by a username or computer name beginning with a configurable prefix string. Okay, I have username in there, but I probably should just call this a computer name. Because depending on what you want to do, you can set it by username or by computer name. So our whole goal here is to create an environment that allows users to log on to to approach the kiosk, and then from that kiosk actually log into their environment. Now there are a couple things we have to do here. The first thing we have to do is kind of set up a separate organizational unit structure for kiosk mode. Okay, and that's really easy. In fact, I've already done that. We did that way long ago. Then we have to set the default client values and add in those client accounts. These can be typically, I'm going to show you MAC addresses, but you could do it by computer names as well. Okay, there's the MAC address has a specific prefix on it, and your computer name would have to have a specific prefix on it for it to function as well. I believe the computer name is like custom dash, something like that. Once we've done that, then we turn on client authentication, and then we can connect to clients from, or connect to our virtual desktops from those clients in kiosk mode. And in fact, VMware has this really nice little CMD file, essentially a batch file, that you can run on the client so that when the user attempts to log out, or when the user does log out of their virtual desktop, the next thing that that script attempts to do is to actually reconnect back into the virtual infrastructure. So you really do treat these Windows boxes like kiosks so that they can connect into your virtual infrastructure in whatever way you need. Here we are back on vcon.company.pri. If you haven't noticed lately, we've sort of been moving way away from the View Administrator console and more towards a lot of command line stuff. And that really doesn't change here whenever we're talking about kiosk mode. In fact, we're going to be using here in this nugget a new command that does a whole bunch of stuff, one of which is all the steps that are required to get kiosk mode up and running. That's called VDM admin. And if I run the /? switch, you can see that there's a whole bunch of stuff that this thing can do associated with users and desktops, agents and machines, connection servers, and infrastructure. Okay, if we can go and view more information there, but just be aware that the command exists. There are many things. There are a number of things inside of View that are not exposed into the View Administrator console that are available through this VDM admin tool. Okay. So we got a couple things we have to do. All right, the first thing we have to do is to actually just verify our Active Directory, our whole OU structure. When creating virtual or kiosk mode virtual desktops, it is generally a good idea to create them in their own individual, independent, isolated organizational unit. We're going to have to populate some information about that here in just a minute. So earlier we actually created this View Kiosk Desktops OU. Okay, and that OU eventually will contain where we're going to put those desktops. Okay, so we have to actually start by setting some of the default values for what we're going to use for those desktops. And let me actually, this is going to be something easier to do if I copy the command line out of here. There we go, that's what I'm looking for. In addition to the View Kiosk Desktops OU, there's actually one other thing that we're going to require, and that is a group, which in my case, I'm just going to make it the same name. Okay, so new group, and we're going to call this View Kiosk Desktops. Very important because VMware View, strangely enough, needs the pre-Windows 2000 name for the group. Okay, so make sure that you're using this. There's my group. Okay, and my View Kiosk Desktops are going to be, we'll populate that here in just a little bit. So this is what we need to do here to prepare Active Directory for those values. Now what we need to do is use that VDM admin command to actually set up some of the default values for how we're going to identify what authentication occurs. So using the /-q command, we're going to set up our client authentication defaults. Okay, the organizational unit we're using is in company.pri, then in View Desktops, and then the subfolder of View Desktops called View Kiosk Desktops. If you're not familiar with LDAP language, remember it always goes backwards. Okay, I am going to set it not to expire passwords, although you can if you wish. And then we're also going to point this to the global group called View Kiosk Desktops. So this sets those default settings for what we want to do with kiosk-based desktops. Okay, with that, then we need to populate those. We need to populate VMware View with the different desktops that are going to participate as kiosks. Okay, one of the first things I have to do is actually figure out, well, okay, I need to know what the MAC address is for one of these clients. I don't want to have to rename all those kiosks. I don't want to have to deal with naming. I'm just going to do it by MAC address. So let me go back here to client 1. And I want to figure out what the MAC address is for client 1. And you are probably firmly aware of all the different ways in which you can locate a MAC address. But I want to use this as an opportunity to show you kind of a neat tool that comes with VMware. So in program files, VMware, CD, VMware, and then CD, VMware, View, and then the client command, CD, VMware, View, CD client, and then bin. There's a tool here called WSWC. You may recognize this tool as the tool that launches that. Okay, so this is effectively the same thing as the VMware View client link that we're working with here. But interestingly enough, this WSWC command comes with some interesting other stuff that you can apply to it. So I can figure out what the desktop name that I want to auto start, or a file, or a language ID, or a desktop layout, the screen size, for example. Do I want to confirm rollback operations? Lots of little, useful troubleshooting and administrative stuff that I might use if I were kind of trying to figure out what's going on a client. The one that I'm curious in using for this time, however, is WSWC-print environment info. What that gives me is a list of the environment information that I can use, including the nice MAC address there for this computer. Okay, that MAC address I'm going to add in as an account for this desktop. All right, let me flip back here to vCon. So back here on vCon, what I need to do is add the accounts for those clients that are eventually going to participate as kiosk computers. And let me copy and paste this other command line out here so you can see it. VDM admin -q client auth. I am adding in the domain company and the client ID. There's the MAC address and the group View Kiosk Desktops. That adds in that client authentication. So I've got now that mapping between the device and then its use as a kiosk mode computer. Next thing I have to do is actually enable the authentication of clients in kiosk mode. And that's a pretty simple command. It's just the -q-enable. And I'm going to target this to the server vcon. Lastly, I want to just give a quick verification of which clients I've identified are to be used as kiosk clients. If I do the -list command here, you can see that I have a client ID of cm- and then the MAC address for that computer. Okay, and I get a GUID that's associated with it. If I were using computer name mapping, that wouldn't be CM, that would probably be something like config- or custom-, excuse me. This gives me information about the common name here for the connection server. Do I have client authentication enabled true? Am I requiring a password? No, none at this point. So now this client is all set up and ready to go for use as a kiosk. There are some activities now that you will have to go through in order to lock down this client. And I'm not going to show you what those activities are. You typically would use a group policy, for example, to lock the client down so that there's only one thing that that client can do, which is essentially to run the VMware View client here. In fact, if you want to get really kind of particularly exciting about it, here under C and then Program Files, VMware, and then VMware View, in the client bin folder, there actually is a kiosk mode.cmd file that you can use to launch the View client in kiosk mode. Now, what is kiosk mode? That means that when the client exits, so user's done and user logs out of their session, the client is going to conditionally restart the client based on how that last user came out. So what you're doing is you're creating an environment where when the last user is done and they log off, they walk away, the View client then just restarts and reconnects back up again. Let's see how this looks. I'll minimize this, and then I'm going to copy this to the clipboard here because I'm going to go to the run command and repopulate this back in because I got to get to that location, cd / there. Is that going to work? Yes. So kiosk mode.cmd, and you'll notice that I need to provide a -server URL here. So kiosk mode-cmd -server URL vcon.company.pri. There we go. And you'll see that kiosk mode launches me up. I now no longer see the start bar down here. I have a full screen picture into the virtual desktop environment. I'm logging into that virtual desktop environment. And as soon as it comes up, well, then I can go about operating however I want. When I'm done, I can click to log off of this computer. It goes through the log off process and then relaunches the VMware View client again. So useful solution here. You'll notice that one of the behaviors that you're seeing here that really identifies how you're going to have to set up the View client appropriately on that kiosk. Did you notice that I actually logged in using the same username as what I was logging in with before? You will want to disable that behavior. Otherwise, every time the user logs out, well, they're going to log the user right back in again. So it's kind of one of those reverse SSO sort of situations where you don't actually want single sign-on between the local machine and the View desktop. But this provides you, again, some understanding about how the kiosk mode looks for those users as they interoperate with their computers. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've talked about kiosk mode and how kiosk mode enables thin clients or lockdown PCs to essentially be a stateless source for starting out the View client. We discussed how end users typically don't log into that device. We don't really think of the users logging into that device, although they can. And if they don't log in, we still have to have some sort of authentication there, so we can use View Manager's flexible authentication to authenticate the device as opposed to the user. And that authentication can be by MAC address or by computer name, beginning with a configurable prefix string. And I showed you how to actually set up the MAC address authentication so that client's MAC address is automatically allowed to log on to those View desktops. And then down in the interaction portion, we spent some time preparing Active Directory for kiosk mode, setting those default client values, building those client accounts, and then turning on client authentication. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.